It was another night in the city that never apologized. Neon lights blinked through the rain. Horns echoed off glass buildings. People rushed by with umbrellas, headphones, or empty stairs seek, drowning in their own chaos. Inside a five-star restaurant, Ethan Blackwell sat alone. Corner table, dark suit, expensive watch. Eyes fixed on nothing. The waiter brought him a perfectly plated dinner pan-seared duck, aged red wine, sides arranged like artwork. Ethan barely touched it. He wasn't hungry. Not for food, anyway. The conversation around hemstock tips, politics, shallow laughter blurred into static. He signed the bill, stood up, and grabbed the untouched leftovers. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. His driver waited by the curb. But something stopped him. Across the street, under the soft glow of a street lamp, sat a girl. Young, maybe mid-20s, wrapped in a worn coat, legs crossed, a sketch pad balanced on her knees. Her fingers were stained with charcoal. Her face focused. She was drawing the people walking by, one after another, like a quiet observer of a world that never looked back at her. Ethan stepped off the curb, walked across the street, and without a word, held out the bag. She looked up. Their eyes met for the first time. He expected surprise, gratitude, embarrassment. Instead, she simply nodded. Not a thank you, not a smile. Just a calm, steady note as if she were accepting a trade, not a favor. He waited a moment, unsure why. She took the bag, set it down beside her sketch pad, and went right back to drawing. Her pencil moved across the page like he wasn't even standing there anymore. Ethan turned and walked away, but something about her lingered. The way she held her chin high, the way she didn't flinch under his gaze, the way she refused to look helpless, even when he'd seen the hollowness in her cheeks. It was pride. That was it. She had nothing but still had pride. And for a man who had everything, that shook him. Her name was Lena Moore, 26, street artist by day, waitress by night, no savings, no family, no backup plan, just grit and a stubborn belief that beauty still mattered in a world that barely looked up. By morning, her hands were stained with coffee and dishwater. By afternoon, with charcoal and paint. Every day, she carved out her corner of the city, usually a spot near the bookstore, where foot traffic slowed just enough for people to glance her way. She never begged, never asked for coins, just drew. Portraits, skies, dreams. Most people walked by without a word. Some paused. Fewer paid. But she kept showing up rain, shine, or snow. Because it was the only thing she had left that made her feel like herself. And then came him. She had only seen his face for a moment the night before. Dark suit, sharp jawline, cold eyes. A man who looked like he hadn't smiled in years. He didn't give her money, just leftovers. And even then, not with pity, but detachment. Still, it had stuck with her. Not the food, the look in his eyes. Like someone holding the weight of 1,000 yesterdays. That morning, she sat by her window in the shared apartment she could barely afford. The smell of mildew and instant noodles filled the air. She flipped open her sketchbook, and she drew him. Not as he looked, but as she imagined he might once have been. Softer, warmer, eyes less burdened. A version of the man who had handed her dinner like he was handing her a piece of himself, even if he didn't realize it. She labeled the page, the suit, not a name, just a symbol of wealth, of mystery, of loneliness. She didn't know who he was, didn't expect to see him again. But in that small act of drawing made from memory, of a man who didn't ask her name, Lena had unknowingly started something. Something far bigger than either of them could see. Ethan Blackwell stood at the top of a tower built on ambition and watched it begin to crumble. Blackwell Industry, once a rising star in the tech world, was now bleeding from the inside. Layoffs, product delays, headlines screaming scandal. Behind the polished glass walls and curated press releases, the truth was sharp. The company was on the edge of collapse. The boardroom had become a battlefield. "Sell it, Ethan," they told him. "We can still walk away with something. Cut your losses. Step down before you're dragged down." He listened, silent, unmoving. And then finally he said the one word that made them all shift uncomfortably in their seats. No, because to them, it was just business. But to Ethan, this company was personal. He had built it from scratch, poured his 20s, his 30s, his soul into it, not to impress the world, not for money, but to prove to himself that he was worth something, that he could create stability in a life that had never given him any. But now, that legacy was slipping through his fingers. Every day, more investors pulled out. Stock prices dropped like cold stones into dark water. The media smelled blood. Competitors circled like vultures. And Ethanon's praise as a visionary was now being called reckless, out of touch, finished. But the most painful part? He wasn't sure they were wrong. He stared at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, his empire below, flickering in lights and fog. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt tired. Not just physically, but soul-deep tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something alone for too long. Still, he refused to let go. Not yet. He would save the company. He didn't know how, but he had to believe that somehow something would change, even if that change came from the last place he'd expect. Some moments feel random, others feel like the city itself is trying to speak. It was a gray afternoon, heavy with summer rain. Ethan had left a brutal investor meeting and walked instead of taking the car, something he hadn't done in years. No destination, no purpose, just movement. He ended up outside a small bookstore on 6th and Alder, the kind of place that smelled like paper and time. And that's when he saw her again. Lena. Same coat. Same calm focus. But today she wasn't alone. 3 children sat on the sidewalk around her, giggling as she drew their faces on cheap parchment paper with a stick of charcoal. A 4th kid danced in front of her, trying to hold still while sneaking glances at the sketch. She didn't speak much. She just smiled softly with her eyes more than her lips and let the kids' joy fill the space. Ethan stood across the street, unseen, unmoving. Something in him tightened. She was different from the people he knew, not trying to impress, not chasing anything, just existing, creating, giving. He watched longer than he meant to, and when she packed up her things and disappeared into the crowd, he hesitated before crossing the street to where she had been. One sketch had been left behind, half tucked under the leg of a bench to keep it from blowing away. He picked it up, expecting one of the kids' portraits. But it wasn't. It was him. Not a perfect likeness, but unmistakable. His sharp features, but softened. The cold CEO, drawn with a kind expression, his eyes warm, hopeful, almost kind. He stared at it for a long time. She hadn't asked his name. She didn't know who he was. And yet, she had seen him differently than anyone ever had, gentler, as if beneath the armor and the exhaustion, there was still something worth saving. Ethan folded the sketch carefully, tucked it into his coat pocket, and for the first time in weeks, something inside him shifted. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe fate had just tapped him on the shoulder. Ethan had closed billion-dollar deals, negotiated with titans, stepped into rooms where silence meant power and words were weapons, but tracking down one street artist, that proved harder than anything he'd done in years. He asked around, walked neighborhoods his car had never driven through, carried the folded sketch in his coat pocket like a compass, hoping it would somehow lead him back to her. And then, One morning, he found her. On a quiet corner near a bakery, she was sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, painting the outline of an old man holding a sunflower. Her fingers were smudged with gold paint. Her hair was messy. She looked peaceful. Ethan hesitated, heart pounding in a way he didn't understand, then stepped forward. "You drew me," he said. Lena looked up, surprised but not startled. Her eyes locked onto his. "You were watching," she replied calmly. "I noticed." He reached into his coat and unfolded the sketch, held it out like proof. "This is, more me than I have ever seen." She gave a small shrug. "Maybe you just forgot who you were." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he offered something else. A business card, a name, an invitation. "I want to commission you, not just for me, for my company. I want your art on the wall of our lobby. Something real, something people won't forget." She stared at him. The silence stretched. "I'm not a corporate artist," she said, "and I don't paint on command. I'll pay," he started, but she shook her head. "It's not about the money." He studied her. She wasn't negotiating. She was deciding whether she could trust him. Finally, she said, "One mural. My idea. My message. No edits." Ethan nodded without hesitation. And so, 3 days later, she walked into the polished glass doors of Blackwell Industries wearing jeans covered in paint and a backpack full of brushes, and stood in the same marble lobby that had seen 1,000 suits pass through without ever stopping to look at the walls. By the time she finished 3 weeks later, the entire building had changed. The mural was bold, cracked concrete walls blooming with flowers, a faceless figure reaching toward the sky from beneath the weight of fallen stone. It was raw, beautiful, unapologetic. At the bottom corner, she had written 5 simple words: "Hope lives in the cracks." A photo of it went viral within hours. Then news outlets picked it up. Then the public came not to invest, but to feel. And for the first time in years, people were talking about Blackwell Industries again. But not because of its products, because of its heart. And Ethan? He stood in the lobby late one night, staring at the mural, and wondering how someone who had so little could give so much. Some people carry their scars on their skin. Others hide them behind quiet smiles and unfinished stories. Lena Moore was the latter. To the world, she was spirited, sharp, untouched by fear. She laughed easily at broken elevators, spilled paint, and her own clumsy mistakes. But beneath it all, there were shadows. Ethan began noticing the patterns. She never talked about family. She avoided holidays like they were landmines. And when children came near, she'd light up too bright, too fast, like someone trying to hold on to something already slipping away. One evening after the mural was done, and most of the office had gone dark, Lena stayed behind packing her brushes slowly, fingers moving like her thoughts were somewhere else. Ethan walked in, unannounced. "You don't like goodbyes," he said softly. She glanced at him, half smiling. "I don't believe in endings, just changes no one asked for." They sat in silence for a moment. The mural loomed behind them, casting long shadows on the marble floor. He asked, "Did you always want to be an artist?" Her hand stilled. "I used to draw with my brother," she said, almost too quietly. "In foster homes, on the backs of cereal boxes, whatever we could find." She didn't say his name, didn't say what happened to him, but her voice cracked just slightly like a window left open during a storm. "I lost him," she added, as if that explained everything. Ethan didn't ask more. He knew the look in her eyes, one he had seen in the mirror too often. Loss that doesn't fade, memories that don't ask permission? She shifted quickly, changing the subject, teased him about his tailored suits and unreadable face, laughed, lightened the air, but he didn't laugh back, because for the first time, he saw her not as a girl with paint on her hands, but as a woman still piecing herself back together from a childhood she never chose. And though he didn't know how, or Wythen felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Drawn, drawn to her fire, her resilience, her refusal to let pain define her. He wanted to know more. But the walls inside him, the ones built brick by brick over decades of disappointment, were still too high. So he said nothing, just stayed a little longer, watching her in the quiet and wondering how someone so broken could shine so brightly. Some storms don't start with thunder, they begin with a headline. It was just after dawn when the news broke. Blackwell Industries implicated in major software failure. Millions of users affected, regulators demanding answers. The company's flagship product and AI-powered security system had glitched, and in its failure, doors across the country refused to unlock. People stranded, businesses exposed. One elderly man trapped in his home for hours nearly died. The backlash was immediate. Legal threats, protests, hashtags. The press swarmed. Investors fled. And Ethan Blackwell, already standing on a crumbling foundation, felt the earth finally give out beneath him. By nightfall, the building was nearly empty. Only a few lights glowed on the top floor. His office, the last refuge. He sat there in the dark, tie undone, shirt wrinkled, a bottle of something expensive, half gone on the table. The mural Lena painted glowed faintly through the glass lobby far below. Hope lives in the cracks, but tonight, all he saw were cracks. He didn't hear her come in. Lena stood in the doorway, quiet, still, no makeup, paint on her jeans. Her backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. She took in the scene, his slumped figure, the chaos on the desk, the silence pressing against the windows like fog. "I let them down," he muttered without looking at her. His voice was hoarse, empty. Lena didn't speak, didn't ask for details. She just stepped inside, walked over, and lowered herself onto the floor beside the couch, her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest. She didn't offer comfort, didn't fill the air with empty reassurances. She simply stayed. The minutes passed slowly. Ethan stared at the ceiling, his breathing unsteady. Lena glanced at him once, then reached into her bag and pulled out a pencil, began sketching on the back of an old receipt. Something about the sound of pencil on paper steadied the room. She didn't draw him. She drew the storm, not with clouds and lightning, but with shadows curling around a lone figure, arms outstretched, refusing to fall. And still, she said nothing. Because sometimes the loudest kind of love is just being there when the lights go out. Sometimes the words we write for ourselves end up saving someone else. Lena never meant for anyone to read it. It wasn't a letter, not really. More like a release scratched out late at night in the corner of her worn notebook, in a moment when silence hurt more than honesty. She had seen Ethan fall apart, seen the cracks beneath the suit, and something inside her, something old and aching, recognized the weight he carried. So she wrote, "I've known what it's like to be blamed for something you didn't break, to be called weak when you're holding the world together with both hands shaking, to be seen as cold just because warmth was used against you once. But broken things can be honest. Cracked walls let light through. And sometimes the people who feel the most ruined are the ones trying hardest not to let anyone else fall." She never said his name, never called it a message. She just folded the page and tucked it between her sketches, under a crumpled jacket near the lobby couch. Forgotten, until Ethan found it. It was the morning after another brutal meeting. He dropped his pen, bent down to pick it up, and his fingers brushed worn paper instead. He read it once, then again. Each word hit harder than the last, like someone had seen through the glass walls he'd spent years building, and gently reached inside. He didn't ask her for permission, He didn't even know why he did it. But that night, under a pseudonym, he uploaded the letter to the company's website, titled it, "From One Cracked Soul to Another." No branding, no spin, just truth. By morning it had gone viral. Screenshots flooded social media. People shared their own stories of failure, of fear, of second chances. Hashtags trended. The angry tone toward Blackwell Industries softened. Not because the problem had gone away, but because someone, somewhere, had reminded them what it meant to fall and keep going anyway. Ethan sat in his office watching the page refresh over and over. Thousands of shares, comments, tears, thank yous. He glanced down at the original note still sitting on his desk. He hadn't told Lena yet, but he would, because her words meant only for herself had reminded the world that even in failure, there's beauty, and maybe, just maybe, she had reminded him too. Behind every empire is a wound. Ethan Blackwell had always been the man who held it together. The suit, the name, the pressure, but long before the company, long before the boardrooms and the skyscrapers, he was just a boy waiting at a window for a father who never came back. His father had built Blackwell Industries from the ground up, charismatic, brilliant, adored by the press. But behind closed doors, he was reckless, selfish, and eventually gone. One morning without warning, he left taking what money he could and vanishing into silence. No note, no explanation, just headlines. Debt. And a 14-year-old Ethan left to pick up the pieces of a family name dragged through the mud. The world assumed Ethan inherited success. What they never saw was that he had spent his entire life trying to rebuild something his father had destroyed. He became the antithesis of the man who raised him, quiet where his father had been loud, disciplined where his father had been careless. But no matter how many deals he closed or towers he built, he still felt like a shadow trying to outrun its source. Until Lena. She didn't ask for the story, but one night, when the office was empty and the air was thick with things unsaid, she found him alone by the mural jaw, clenched, knuckles white, staring into a past only he could see. "Your company's not the only thing you're trying to fix," she said softly. He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. She stepped beside him, not too close, just enough. "You've spent your life proving you're not him," she whispered, "but you're allowed to stop running now." And in that moment, he realized something. Lena didn't see him as a CEO, or a brand, or a broken man hiding behind deadlines and control. She saw the boy, the one who had been left behind, the one who never got the apology he deserved. And she didn't flinch. Ethan didn't cry, not then. But something inside him softened like armor, loosened for the first time in decades. Because sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one you've lived with the longest. Sometimes healing doesn't come in words. It comes in color, in texture, in silence shared between two people who know what it means to be broken and to keep going anyway. After the viral letter, public sentiment shifted. People didn't want perfection anymore. They wanted real. And Ethan knew Blackwell Industries was going to survive. It couldn't go back to what it was. So he made a decision, not one his board approved of, not one that made logical business sense, but one that felt right. He asked Lena to lead the company's rebrand, not with suits, not with scripts, but with her vision, honest, raw, human. At first, she refused. "I'm not a campaign manager," she said. "You don't need another face. You need a direction." But Ethan didn't back down. "I need your truth," he told her. "The world trusts you because you don't try to sell them anything." Reluctantly, she agreed. They began working late nights in a quiet corner of the office, her with sketches and mock-ups, him with notes and restless pacing. They argued, challenged, pushed each other. She painted on instinct. He questioned every detail, but slowly the campaign took shape. Not sleek, not corporate, real. Stories of failure and hope. Photos of hands rough, stained, reaching. Taglines like whispers. Built by the broken. Progress isn't always clean. And as the campaign grew, so did something else. They'd sit shoulder to shoulder at 1 a.m., their coffee cold, her fingers smudged with ink, his tie long abandoned. He'd catch her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. She'd feel his gaze linger a second too long when she laughed, but neither spoke it aloud. They weren't ready to name it. Not yet. It lived in the quiet pauses, in the way he brought her coffee exactly how she liked it, 2 sugars, no cream. In the way she stopped sketching whenever he looked too tired, too heavy, and simply stayed. They were building more than a campaign. They were building trust, and trust for both of them was harder than love. In a world that had burned them both, this slow, silent closeness was sacred. No declarations, no promises, just the quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, art could save them both. Some losses never bury themselves. They linger like ghosts behind closed doors, waiting for the right silence to slip through. Lena had always carried the memory of her brother like a secret folded in her chest. He was the one bright piece of childhood she hadn't let the system take. They had bounced through foster homes together, whispering dreams to each other under thin blankets, drawing comic books in pencil on paper grocery bags. Then one day, he was gone, transferred, adopted, they told her. She waited. Weeks, then months. No letters, no calls, and eventually silence hardened into grief. She told herself he was dead. It was easier than hoping, but fate is cruel and sometimes kind in the strangest ways. One late evening, in the corner of the office where she and Ethan had built their campaign, she dropped a stack of photos. A few were from old employee files used in branding mock-ups. One face caught her breath. She froze. He was older in the photo, taller, thinner, but the eyes. She would have known those eyes anywhere. Daniel Moore, junior developer, hired 3 years ago, worked 6 months, then gone. Lena didn't say anything to Ethan that night. She just packed up and left in a daze, the edges of her world tilting. Her past wasn't buried. It had been inside this building all along. The next morning, Ethan noticed the shift. She was quieter, distracted, her usual spark dulled behind a fog of unanswered questions. When he asked, she brushed it off. But Ethan had learned to hear the things she didn't say. Later that night, alone in his office, he looked up the employee record himself. It was him. No doubt. Daniel Moore. No emergency contact, no forwarding address. Disappeared without notice. Ethan stared at the screen, then leaned back in his chair, heart heavy with a choice. Lena hadn't asked for his help, but he couldn't just leave it alone. He made a few calls, quiet, discreet, used his connections, pulled archived files, started digging, not to control, not to protect his company, but because for the first time in years, someone else's pain felt more urgent than his own. And if there was a way to bring even one piece of her past back to her, he'd find it, even if it meant losing her trust to do it, because some ghosts don't deserve to stay ghosts. Not when they still have names. Trust is fragile. It doesn't crack loud, it fractures in silence. And when it breaks, it cuts deeper than lies. Lena wasn't looking for answers that day. She was looking for her sketchbook. But when she opened Ethan's desk drawer to grab it, she found something else. A folder, marked with her brother's name. She froze, opened it. Inside were printouts, notes, timestamps, emails, photos, private investigations. Ethan had been looking for Daniel, not just recently, for weeks, behind her back. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Not because of what was there, but because he hadn't told her. When Ethan walked in, she was already standing, the folder clutched to her chest like a wound. "You went digging through my past," she said, voice low, cracking. "I was trying to help," he replied. "Quiet. You had no right." He tried to explain that he wanted to find Daniel, that he'd only meant to give her something she'd lost, that he thought he was doing the right thing. But it didn't matter, because to Lena, it wasn't about Daniel anymore. It was about choice, her pain, her story, her timing, and he'd taken that from her. "You used me," she whispered, voice trembling. "My art, my words, my grief. You put it into a campaign that sells hope, but you never gave me the dignity of telling my own truth." He said nothing, because maybe she was right, and silence was the only honest thing left between them. She walked out, left the building, left him. No final words, no dramatic storm, just the soft sound of footsteps down a hallway that suddenly felt miles long. Ethan didn't stop her, because deep down, he believed this was what he always did. He broke the things he cared about, pushed people away before they could leave on their own. She had been the one light in a season of shadows, and no, he'd extinguish that too. As the rain began to fall against the tall office windows, Ethan sat alone, watching it blur the city, watching her disappear into it. And for the first time since he was a boy, he didn't just feel abandoned. He felt like the one who deserved to be. Ethan had always believed in control. Control the product, the narrative, the outcome. But after Lena walked away, there was nothing left to control except the truth. He could have shelved the campaign, waited, rewritten it, repackaged it. But he didn't. He released it. As it was. No edits, no polish, no spin. Just her voice, her story, her art. The campaign launched quietly on a rainy Tuesday. No press conference, no grand unveiling, just a short message on the company's homepage. "We were built by the broken." Then the images rolled in. Lena's sketches, hands reaching through cracks, faces stitched with hope. Quotes pulled from her letters, scrawled in her handwriting. "I've failed more times than I've stood tall, but I'm still here. Sometimes survival is the bravest kind of success. If you're broken, you're not alone." By midnight, the site had crashed from traffic. By morning, "Was built by the broken" was trending in 5 countries. And Lena, sitting alone in her apartment, her sketchpad unopened on the table, stared at her phone as message after message flooded in. Strangers, thousands of them. A burned-out nurse in Ohio, a war veteran in the Philippines, a teenage girl in Berlin who hadn't spoken to her parents in months. All thanking her, all saying her words helped them breathe again, all reminding her that what she thought was pain had become connection. And for the first time in years, Lena cried. Not quiet tears, not just 1 or 2, but deep sobs cracked open from somewhere she thought had gone numb. It wasn't about the campaign. It wasn't about going viral. It was the knowing that she had turned her scars into something that meant something, that her voice was heard. Ethan never called, never took credit. His name wasn't on the campaign, but hers was, front and center. It was the kind of gesture that said everything he couldn't say aloud. And though she wasn't ready to forgive him, a part of her heart softened. Because sometimes love doesn't show up with flowers or apologies. It shows up with respect, with truth, with letting go. Some returns aren't grand. They don't come with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes they begin with a quiet walk and the memory of someone who once mattered more than pain. Lena didn't come back for the company. Not the campaign, not the praise. She came back for him. She found Ethan standing outside the same bookstore where their paths had first crossed, the one with the crooked sign and mismatched windows. He wasn't dressed like a CEO today. No tie, No polished shoes. Just a man, holding a brown paper bag. He looked up when he saw her, didn't smile, didn't rush forward, just stood still, like he was afraid one wrong word would scare her away. She stopped in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan reached into the bag and pulled out a small, clumsily wrapped box. "I didn't know what to say," he said, voice quiet. "So, I brought you this." Lena raised an eyebrow. He opened it slowly. Inside, an apple pie, lopsided, a little burned on the edges, clearly homemade, carefully wrapped. She blinked, stunned. "You remembered," she said softly. "The first thing you ever drew," he nodded. "That day on the sidewalk." "I didn't get it then. Thought it was just a sketch." She looked at him, eyes unreadable, then down at the pie, then back again. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Lena," he said, "for digging without asking, for not trusting you to trust me, for taking your story before you were ready to share it." She didn't reply right away, but then slowly, she reached for the box, cradled it in her arms. "It's burnt," she murmured. He gave a sheepish half smile. "Like I said, didn't know what I was doing." She stared at him a moment longer, then nodded. And in that quiet nodding, the way her fingers curled around the box, there was forgiveness. Not spoken, not complete, but real. They didn't kiss. They didn't cry. They just walked together down the sidewalk, side by side, two people who had learned how to break, and now were learning how to begin again. And somewhere above the noise of the city, a little peace settled between them. Like maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. Time didn't heal everything, but it helped things breathe. Months passed. Blackwell Industries didn't just recover, it evolved. Gone were the polished, untouchable surfaces. In their place, raw edges, honest campaigns, real stories. It wasn't a tech giant anymore. It was something human. And at the heart of that change, even if she didn't wear a title, was Lena. She didn't go back to the office. She didn't need to, because her art now lived everywhere, on murals, on packaging, on walls in cities she'd never stepped foot in. But that wasn't her proudest moment. It came quietly on a rainy spring night when her first solo gallery opened in a reclaimed warehouse in Brooklyn. The crowd was warm but small. Artists, strangers, a few curious critics. And in the very back corner stood Ethan. No fanfare, no suit, just silent support, hands in his pockets, eyes on her. When their eyes met across the room, she smiled. Not the guarded ones she used to wear, but the kind that said, "You're safe now." Later that night, after the last guest had gone, they stood under fairy lights strung between exposed brick. There was music somewhere, soft, jazzy, half forgotten. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a notebook, worn, dog-eared. Hers. "I kept this," he said, handing it to her. "I wanted to return it, but I wasn't ready to let go of the pages that saved me." Lena held it gently, then looked up at him. "What now?" she asked. He didn't give a speech, just stepped closer, took her hand in both of his, and asked simply, "Will you write the next chapter with me?" Not as the girl he once pitied, not as the man she once saved, but as two people who chose each other without masks, without rescues, just equals. She nodded once, and together they walked out into the night, not toward a fairy tale ending, but toward something far better. A beginning,